It's been belligerent and then
Very, very.
The whole train was freaked out. He was either gonna pull a gun, a knife, or
He said, "I'm willing to die. I'm willing to die. You know, I'm willing to get killed." And,
the guy at the stand did take him down very respectfully and just held him down.
he just held him. He didn't tell him. Yeah.
There's two young ladies right here.
Yeah.
Okay, what did you see?
What did I see? I was sitting over there. I heard the young man that's on the floor saying, "Hey, I'm willing to die. I'll do anything. I'm willing to die. I'll go to jail. I don't care. I don't care." And he was saying it so loud that everyone turned around. So this young man, he got belligerent and he tackled him down.
Oh.
The one that just passed away in the brown jacket, the one that just went past.
So he took him to the ground? The guy with the brown jacket took him to the ground.
Yeah, he took him to the ground and gave him a chokehold. Not a hard chokehold, just enough to secure him. And the guy fought. And he kept holding him. All right. And then that's when everybody totally realized what was going on. And I think this guy's on drugs, because when he came in, he was unbelievably off the charts. He scared the living daylights out of everybody.
How did he bring him down to the ground? He picked him up and threw him on the ground?
Then he stood up, grabbed him, turned him around, and put him to the ground.
All right.
You can look at that on a multi-faceted approach of everything that's wrong with the system that we're facing. One, look at the photo that they used to show the victims. It seemed like it was a young, innocent child who was brutally murdered, and it gave that impression. When you looked at the photo that was being used, it wanted to set up in the minds of people that we were dealing with a young, innocent child that, just a Michael Jackson intimidator that was just brutally assaulted. Then you look at the complete failure of our mental health system, a complete failure. The young man in this case was going within our system, throughout the revolving door of our system. Now, we're on the subway where we're hearing someone talking about hurting people, killing people. You have someone on that subway who was responding, doing what we should have done as a city and a state of having a mental health facility. Those passengers were afraid. I'm hoping that the jury will hear all the facts. Based on all the facts that's laid out, a jury of his peers would make the right decision. And I don't want to prejudge that. I'm just looking at all the facts that are involved here and what we did to get to where we are and what we're seeing. Because that could have easily been the case where you saw 3 innocent people murdered on our street 2 weeks ago.
And I wanted to, as I prefaced in the first bit of the show, dismantle a lot of those landmines around topics and phrases that have been contaminated by maybe Francis's or Schmidt's or other people's records that actually prove really useful for us. And one of those is Anarcho-Tyranny. And from the American context, both how do you understand it from your reading and how have you seen that play out?
Well, Anarcho-Tyranny is really just an article that Sam Francis wrote. Interestingly, he has much more in-depth and complex systems with which he tries to explain political behavior. But Anarcho-Tyranny is really the one that is caught on, and I think that's because it just is a word that captures exactly what many of us are feeling. In the United States especially, but of course in the UK as well, we're in a situation where the ruling class is leveraging its ability to decide the state of exception, when the law will apply and when it will not, and they use that to go ahead and punish those that would present any kind of challenge to the ruling order. And instead of applying the law to, say, violent criminals that are regularly making victims of the average person, they apply it to people who are paying their taxes and contributing to society, because they do have the ability, that middle class. St. Francis was famous for talking about the revolution from the middle. They are the ones that do have some level of access to capital and institutional power that might be able to challenge the rulers. And so instead of punishing those that do terrible acts to innocent people, instead we see the state focusing on punishing those that might create any kind of challenge to their power through the application of Anarcho-Tyranny.
But the thing that I found really interesting in Anarcho-Tyranny is that it seems to go against the blank slatism that the enforcement mechanism of anarcho-tyranny tries to insist on. So by carrying out anarcho-tyranny, you're doing it on behalf of a permanently existing criminal class that you can't ever quite eliminate, against the law-abiding middle class that believe that the rule of law is what matters and not, as de Maistre said, the men that wrote the constitutions and their sentiments being upheld. But then the actual anarcho-tyranny as it plays out is often using speech codes to suppress those that complain about the runaway lawlessness in civilization. And so I wonder if anarcho-tyranny is a sort of inevitable consequence of the insistence on anti-racism and the blank slate by like the post-war consensus, and if this can exist under any other conditions where the law would be upheld consistently because the civilization has a set of shared sentiments that stop them from doing it.
You know, the debate I'm always having with my friend Nima Parvini, academic agent, is whether the ideology follows power or power follows ideology. And the answer is really obviously both. They're always working in tandem. And so this ideology is necessary to go ahead and facilitate the consolidation of power. But the consolidation of power follows this particular path because the ideology also lays it out in that direction. They are true believers who also are using the things they believe in for their own material gains, their own gains in power.
Imagine living in a society where chaos and like oppressive control exist at the same time. It sounds kind of like a dystopian nightmare.
Right.
But some people say that this is actually happening right now, and they call it anarcho-tyranny. And that's what we're going to unpack today using a real-life case. The controversial trial of Daniel Penny.
Yeah, it is a fascinating concept, and like you said, it does seem paradoxical at first. But I think by going into some of the legal analyses and social commentary, as well as the works of Samuel T. Francis, the political writer who actually coined the term anarcho-tyranny, we can start to see how this idea might be playing out in current events.
Okay, so for those who aren't super familiar with the case, can you maybe just give us like a brief overview of what happened with Daniel Penny and like why it's caused so much debate?
Sure. So Daniel Penny, he was a former Marine. He's currently facing manslaughter charges in the death of Jordan Neely. Jordan Neely was a homeless man who had a history of mental illness and violence. The incident itself happened on a New York City subway where Neely was reportedly acting erratically and aggressively. Penny intervened and he restrained Neely, which ultimately led to his death. And the case has become a focal point for discussions about a lot of things like race, class, self-defense, and the role of law enforcement in society.
Okay, so now let's get into the core of this deep dive, which is anarcho-tyranny. So what exactly does this term mean?
So anarcho-tyranny basically describes a societal condition where you have this simultaneous breakdown of law and order when it comes to certain types of crime. This is the anarchy element. And at the same time, you have a really heavy-handed, often arbitrary use of authority in other areas, which is the tyranny part. It's the system where you have really serious offenses going unchecked while everyday citizens are overregulated or even targeted for relatively minor things.
Okay, so it's kind of like this two-pronged problem. A failure to address real threats, and then this overreach of power in areas that maybe aren't as critical.
Precisely. And this is where Samuel T. Francis's work becomes really relevant. He argued that this isn't just some random occurrence. It could potentially be a deliberate strategy that governments use to maintain control. By allowing certain types of crime to kind of flourish, they're able to create a climate of fear and insecurity. And this, in turn, makes the public more willing to accept stricter control and limitations on their freedom in other aspects of life.
That's a pretty chilling thought, almost like they're calculatingly manipulating society.
Yeah.
How does the Daniel Penny trial fit into this framework?
Yeah, so supporters of Penny, they argue that Jordan Neely's aggressive behavior and his extensive history of arrests for assault and other offenses, they say that highlights the anarchy element. It's this failure of the system to properly address these things like mental illness, homelessness, and crime. They basically see Penny's actions as a response to this perceived lawlessness and the danger that Neely posed to other people on the subway.
So they're basically saying that he stepped in because law enforcement wasn't really doing anything.
Yeah, exactly. And then they view the prosecution of Penny as an example of the tyranny aspect of anarcho-tyranny. They say that the state is overreaching by charging him with manslaughter because they're basically punishing a citizen who acted to protect himself and others when the authorities weren't there.
So from their perspective, the state's basically cracking down on a guy who was trying to maintain order when it seems like the state itself failed to do so. But, I mean, it's not that straightforward, is it? Because there are also people who see it completely differently.
Right, absolutely. Critics of this perspective, they argue that focusing solely on the perceived failures of law enforcement ignores deeper societal issues like poverty, inadequate mental health services, and systemic inequalities that contribute to crime and social unrest in the first place. They basically see the prosecution of Penny as just upholding the law, regardless of the circumstances. And they say that if we allow individuals to just take the law into their own hands, that sets a dangerous precedent.
So it's this real tension between like wanting to be safe and the need to like uphold a just legal system.
Exactly.
It seems like this Penny trial has become a real battleground for these competing ideas.
It really has. I mean, the trial has sparked this very complex debate about the role of individual responsibility versus the state's obligation to ensure public safety. And it raises questions about, like, what exactly is legitimate self-defense in a society that's dealing with issues like mental illness and homelessness?
It seems like this case goes way beyond just the individuals involved. It seems like it's tapping into like deeper anxieties and societal divisions.
Exactly. I think to really get a grasp of the implications here, we have to understand how the media and political narratives have shaped public perception of the trial and the broader concept of anarcho-tyranny itself.
Now, before we get into all of that, let's take a second to go over a key feature of anarcho-tyranny. You mentioned earlier the selective application of justice. Can you just elaborate on what that means and maybe give us some real-world examples?
Sure. So this feature refers to a situation where the law is applied inconsistently, often with like a bias towards certain groups or types of offenses. So imagine a scenario where like you have minor offenses by people from marginalized communities that are heavily penalized, but then you have more serious crimes by others that are kind of overlooked or treated leniently. This unequal application, it creates a sense that the law is not actually blind and that it serves particular interests or agendas.
So it makes it seem like there's a lot of unfairness and it erodes people's trust in the institutions that are supposed to uphold justice.
Yes.
And then that fuels anxieties.
Right. And it's also worth noting that this selective application can be both intentional, like Francis suggested, and it can also just be a consequence of systemic biases within the legal system.
Okay.
So I think unpacking these nuances is really crucial for understanding how anarcho-tyranny might actually be playing out in our society.
Okay, so that brings up a lot of questions about how we actually address these complex issues. But first, let's examine how the media and political narratives have shaped public perception of this Daniel Penny trial and this whole idea of anarcho-tyranny. So what are some of the key observations there?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how different media outlets and political commentators will present completely different views of the same events. They often frame the trial through their own ideological lenses, which leads to very polarized opinions, and it makes it really hard to have a nuanced discussion about the case and the underlying issues.
So everyone's looking at the same situation through a different filter.
Yeah.
And that just makes the existing divisions worse.
Exactly. And this is where understanding this concept of anarcho-tyranny becomes so crucial, because it gives us a framework for understanding these seemingly contradictory dynamics. Like, how can we have both lawlessness and oppressive control at the same time?
Okay, so if we connect this back to all those features of anarcho-tyranny that we were discussing earlier, where do we see those actually playing out in the Penny case?
So we already talked about the under-enforcement of laws when it comes to genuine criminality and Neely's history of violence and the perception that he wasn't adequately dealt with by the system even though he'd been arrested multiple times. This kind of feeds into that whole narrative.
And then there's the overregulation of regular people and the selective application of justice.
Right. And some people argue that the prosecution of Penny, who, remember, intervened when it seemed like the authorities weren't there, is a perfect example of the state targeting a person who is trying to maintain order when they perceived lawlessness. So, this selective application of justice can further damage trust in institutions and create this feeling that the system is rigged against ordinary people.
And like we were saying before, that erosion of trust seems to be a key component of anarcho-tyranny.
Absolutely. It's essential. When people lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect them and ensure fairness, it can have huge consequences. It can lead to things like a breakdown of social cohesion, people turning to vigilantism, and an increase in political polarization. It can also further damage the legitimacy of government institutions and create this breeding ground for extremism and political instability.
It sounds like it could create this downward spiral.
It definitely could. It should be a starting point for constructive dialogue and problem solving.
It feels like we're at a real turning point here. If this anarcho-tyranny thing is a real problem, what can we do about it? Like, what are the potential solutions?
That's the million-dollar question. If we want to address anarcho-tyranny, if it does exist, it requires an approach with lots of different facets. So strengthening public institutions, addressing the root causes of crime and social unrest, having more open dialogue and understanding between different groups, and promoting responsible civic engagement are all essential steps.
That sounds like a huge task.
It is, but it's not impossible. I think the key is to recognize how complex these issues are and avoid really simplistic solutions and engage in thoughtful and constructive conversations about how we can make society more just and equitable.
This has been really insightful. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
It's been great discussing this with you. It's definitely a multifaceted issue, and I think, exploring those nuances is really key to understanding what anarcho-tyranny could mean for society as a whole.
So let's do that.
Hey there, listeners. If you're finding value in our deep dives and want to dig even deeper, consider grabbing a copy through the Amazon link in the description below. And if you're an audiobook fan, you can dive in with a free 2-month Audible trial on us. Our gift to you. It's a great way to support the channel, explore amazing works on the go, and immerse yourself in these thought-provoking ideas. So, check out those links in the description, and thank you for supporting our work. And we'll keep the deep dives coming.
If this phenomenon is really happening the way some people are saying, like, what are some of the things that could happen? What are the consequences?
One of the biggest concerns is that people will stop trusting public institutions, which, as we talked about before, is already happening. And when people don't trust the systems that are supposed to protect them and make sure things are fair, they might start looking for other options.
Like what? What kind of options are we talking about?
Well, they might hire private security or start vigilante groups or maybe just completely withdraw from civic life. It's like saying, if the system doesn't work for me, I'll just create my own. But when that happens, it can make things even more unstable and fragmented.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like this vicious cycle where the institutions are failing, so people take things into their own hands, which just ends up making things worse and making people trust the system even less.
Exactly. And that can actually make extremism more likely because people are more open to these radical ideas that say they have easy answers to really complicated problems. Another worrying consequence is the rise of vigilantism. When people feel like the authorities aren't doing enough to stop crime or protect them, they might feel like they have to take the law into their own hands.
And that's something we've seen happen a lot throughout history. Vigilante groups tend to pop up when there's a sense of lawlessness or when the government isn't doing its job.
Yeah. And, vigilantism might seem like a quick solution in certain situations, but it can really easily lead to miscarriages of justice. These individuals, they don't have the same training and accountability that law enforcement officers do.
Right. And it also brings up questions about due process and the rule of law.
Right.
Because if people just start taking the law into their own hands, it undermines the whole system.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to the importance of addressing the root causes of crime and social unrest. We can't just focus on the symptoms.
Earlier you said that some people worry that this anarcho-tyranny concept could be used to justify authoritarian policies or scapegoat certain groups. Can you explain what they mean by that?
Sure. They're basically worried that if we only focus on the idea of lawlessness and the need for authority, it could give people an excuse to get rid of civil liberties and give more power to the state, all in the name of security.
So someone could use that idea to justify cracking down on anyone who disagrees with them, or to target marginalized communities and say they're the reason for the problem.
That's the fear, and that's why we have to be really careful about how we use and interpret this concept. We don't want it to become a tool for authoritarians.
So understanding anarcho-tyranny isn't just about analyzing crime or law enforcement policies. It's also about thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about these issues.
Right.
And being careful not to be manipulated.
Absolutely. We need to be smart about the information we take in, be open to different points of view, and stick to the principles of justice and fairness even when things are difficult and complicated.
So to kind of shift gears a little bit, let's talk about some possible solutions. You said before that we need a multifaceted approach to deal with anarcho-tyranny. What specific things can individuals, communities, and institutions do to prevent it from getting worse?
And we need a strategy that addresses both sides, the breakdown of law and order and the potential for too much authority.
So how would that work? What would that look like?
Well, first of all, we have to make sure law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to deal with serious crimes. That means giving them the right training, technology, and funding to be effective. But it's not just about giving them more stuff. It's also about holding them accountable for their actions and making sure they're operating within the law. We need transparency and oversight to build public trust.
So it's about making sure law enforcement can do their job, but also making sure they do it the right way, and respecting people's rights. Okay, so what about the other side, the part about excessive control? How do we stop that?
It starts with paying attention to when the government is overreaching and supporting policies that protect people's civil liberties. Things like challenging laws that are too broad, pushing back against surveillance that violates privacy, and defending freedom of speech and assembly. We also need to think about how technology could be used for social control and make sure it's being used ethically.
So it's about protecting the rights that are fundamental to a free and open society. But it goes beyond laws and policies, right? It's about the culture, too.
Absolutely. We need a culture that respects the rule of law and people's rights. That means promoting civic education, having open and honest conversations about these issues, and encouraging people to participate in their communities. We need to remember that a healthy democracy needs citizens who are informed and engaged and who are willing to hold those in power accountable.
It's about realizing that we all have a responsibility to uphold those principles that are so important for a fair and just society, but also recognizing that these are complicated issues with no easy answers.
We have to recognize that fixing these challenges takes time and commitment to building a society where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
Before we move on to the last part of the deep dive, I want to go back to this idea of trust that we've been talking about. You said that one of the main consequences of anarcho-tyranny is that people lose trust in institutions. How does that loss of trust show up in society? And what does it mean?
Well, it can show up in lots of different ways, like fewer people voting, less civic engagement, more skepticism towards authority figures, and just a general feeling of disillusionment with the whole political process. People might feel like their voices don't matter, like the system is rigged against them, or like the people in power don't care about them.
So it's almost like a feeling of being powerless, like you have no control over the systems that are supposed to represent and protect you.
Exactly, and that can lead to apathy, cynicism, and people withdrawing from public life. They might stop voting, stop volunteering, or even stop talking about important social and political issues.
So the less people trust the system, the less they participate in it, which just makes the problems worse and leads to even more distrust.
And that's why it's so important to figure out why this trust is eroding in the first place. It's not just about making institutions more efficient or effective. It's about rebuilding that sense of shared values, making things more transparent and accountable, and showing people that the government is truly committed to serving everyone.
That's a tall order, but it's essential if we want a healthy society.
Absolutely. A society that doesn't have trust is a society that's on shaky ground. It's more vulnerable to division, conflict, and instability.
So as we go deeper into this concept of anarcho-tyranny, we're seeing that it's about much more than just crime rates or laws. It's about that fundamental trust that holds society together. And rebuilding that trust, if it's been damaged, means taking a multifaceted approach and dealing with all of the social, economic, and political factors that contributed to its decline.
I completely agree. It's about understanding that all of these issues are connected.
How do we actually make the rule of law stronger?
Well, first, we have to make sure that law enforcement has what they need to deal with serious crimes. That means giving them the resources, training, and technology to do their jobs effectively. But it can't just be about giving them more tools. We also have to hold them accountable and make sure they're following the law themselves. We need transparency so the public can trust them.
So it's about balancing giving them what they need to do their job with making sure they're not abusing their power. For our listeners who want to learn more about anarcho-tyranny and what it means for society, there's a great book linked in the show description. It goes into a lot of detail about the concept, its history, and some potential solutions to the challenges it presents. And if you found this deep dive insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of complex and thought-provoking topics. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.